Hey guys, I'm Architect Jeje Madatu and welcome back to our Dialux Masterclass. Okay, now we're done with this part of the facade. Let's go to the plan view and then let's start recreating the walls and the inner part of the building. Now let's move the floor plan onto our main floor. Now let's go to the plans tab and then click move plan. Now let's select this corner part of the stair because this is where we have our base point. Now let's click on to that corner part of the stairs on the floor plan. Now let's move it on to our 000 base point. Now let's start tracing the outer walls and also the interior walls. Now let's go back to the furniture tab and click on draw extrusion body. Now let's trace first this front wall. Now let's check the height of the wall. It's 5.3. Edit the height, 5.3. Now let's trace the other outer walls. Click on draw extrusion body. Let's re-edit this. Now input the height, 5.3. Now let's trace the interior walls, but what we're going to do is that we will just gonna probably create a box onto this because we're not going to show the interior, but apparently the main concept is just to show an interior lighting from the facade or from the exterior view. Let's check the height. Probably let's just use 5.1. Duplicate this. Now we are done with this. Let's check the perspective view. Okay, I made a mistake on these two interior walls. Let's probably check again the section file. Let's probably edit the height from the roof truss up to the finished floor line, which is 3.7. And now let's check the distance of the finished floor line up to the grade line, which is 0.6. So let's raise these two boxes 0.6 from the floor or from the grade line, and then edit the height 3.7 meters. Now let's create an interior floor. Go to the draw extrusion body. Now let's trace the interior floor. Let's edit the height 0.6. Now let's re-edit the polygon. Right click, edit basic polygon. Now let's check the perspective view. Okay, that's it. We're done with the interior wall. Now let's go back to the floor plan. Let's trace the columns on these sides of the facade. Let's use this rectangular object. Right click, scale. And if you have noticed that on the front facade, the columns are a bit protruding from the exterior walls. Now let's probably resize this a bit. Extended on the exterior wall. Now let's just duplicate this. No, before that, let's change the height to 5.3 because the exterior walls are at 5.3 meter height. Now let's duplicate these columns. Now let's check the perspective view. And then let's combine these columns. Now we're done with the columns. The next step is that we are going to attach these facade ornaments that we have recreated on the elevation drawings. Now let's move the drawings to its original base point. Now let's go back to the plan tab. Select move plan. Now first select this corner part of the drawing or the site development plan because these were our 0000 base point. Now let's go back to our elevation drawings. Now before we attach these facade ornaments onto our plan, what we're going to do is that we are going to recreate or to make a subtraction objects for the windows because we are going to create hole onto these exterior walls. Same also the niches on the baluster part. Now let's duplicate a rectangular object. And then this is going to be for the windows. Now let's go to the section view. Let's probably adjust the height, the position of the subtraction object. Now let's duplicate these onto the rest of the windows. Now let's create subtraction objects for the baluster niche. Now let's go to the perspective view. Now let's create subtraction objects for the front doors and windows. Now we are done with these subtraction objects. If you have noticed, on both sides of the front windows and doors, there's these ornaments that has similar design with what we have recreated on the columns. We don't have much details onto these. So what we're going to do is that we will just gonna duplicate this this part of the column, and we will just gonna resize it according to the elevation drawings. Let's probably just use the original column objects that we have recreated. Now select this part of the column and then Control C, Control V, and then let's snap it on to that part of the facade. Now let's just resize and duplicate these objects. Now let's delete those duplicated objects that are overlapping. Now let's duplicate these objects onto the other side. Let's delete the other duplicated object. Now let's resize the inner part. Now let's edit this mid part. Let's actually split this. Now let's resize. And then resize this part. Now let's subtract this to create a hole. Now let's resize this. Okay, now let's duplicate these onto the other side. Oh wait, let's resize this part. Let's undo or split. And then resize it again. Okay, now let's subtract again. Also, let's resize this part or duplicate these two objects for the upper part. And then resize again the inner part. Now let's duplicate these objects onto the other side. Now let's combine all these subtraction objects. Then let's click combine. Now let's check on the perspective view. Now let's all group these objects and rotate it. And then we are going to rotate these vertically. Group. Now let's go to this section view and let's rotate these objects. Now let's move it align with the floor level. Now let's move these objects onto the floor plan. Just make sure that these objects are snapped exactly onto the exact location on the floor plan. Now let's ungroup these objects. Now let's do the subtraction. Select the subtraction objects and then select the object to be subtracted, which is the front wall, and then subtract. Let's check the floor plan. Okay, now let's move these. Let's move the floor plan onto our main wall so that we could exactly check if these objects are exactly snapped on the exact location. Now let's check. Let's move these objects, and I'm not really sure if we have made mistake onto this, or probably there's a conflict from the floor plan and the elevation. Let's just do some remedies on this part of the facade. Now let's move this column onto the exact location. Now what we're going to do is that we are going to rescale this. Now let's combine the objects that we can combine. And then let's rescale the width. Right click, scale, so that it will exactly snap onto the exterior wall. Now let's do the same thing onto the other side. Now let's check the other parts. I think we have to move these objects on the right side of the facade and snap it on to the exact location. Now let's split the exterior wall. Now let's do this manually. I'm not really sure if there's a conflict between the elevation and the floor plan. So, but what we need to do here is that we really need to follow the floor plan. Let's move the windows. And select the other objects. Click Control. Okay, I think the windows that we have recreated on the elevation doesn't match on the floor plan, or no, they match. So yeah, now let's do the subtraction again on the exterior walls. Let's probably just combine these subtraction objects first. The one on the right side, and then let's subtract. Now combine these objects, subtract. Same. Now let's go to the left side. Now, as for the baluster side, there's a wall on the back of this part. So actually, it's going to be a double-sided wall. So let's create another exterior wall for that part. Let's duplicate the rectangular object. And then right click, scale, and scale it with the exact length of the front exterior wall. Now as for the width, it's going to be 0.1. Now let's snap it on to the exact location, and then the height, it's going to be 1 meter, and then from the floor, I think it's going to be 4.3. Let's check. Yeah, it's 4.3. Now let's move this object 4.3 from the 0 Z axis, and then height 1 meter. Now let's check. Now moving forward, let's start recreating the front doors and windows. Now let's go back to the plan view. Let's move again the site development plan onto our main floor. Go to the plan tab, and let's move the plan. Now let's go to the elevation drawings. Now let's recreate the front doors and windows. Now let's check the width of those. I think that's going to be 0.05. Now let's duplicate the rectangular object again. Edit the height, 0.05. Now let's duplicate it again for our subtraction object. edit the height, 0.1. Now let's duplicate these again and do the subtraction. Now let's edit the object that we have duplicated. Let's bring it back to 0.05. No, let's probably use 0.04 because it's that part of the window. It's gonna be recessed, kind of recessed or a bit thinner. Now let's move this object onto the center part of the frame. Let's probably move it 0.005 from the z-axis. Now let's duplicate this object again for our subtraction objects. Edit the height, 0.1, because this is going to be the subtraction object. Now let's move it to 0 z-axis. Now let's duplicate these onto the other part. Now let's duplicate these objects again. Now let's do the subtraction. Okay, now let's re-edit the height of these duplicated objects for the innermost window frame. Let's probably edit the height, or the height of these should be lower or shorter than the previous one. So the previous one is 0.04. Let's probably use 0.03, the height or the thickness, and then let's move it on to the center of the frame. 0.03 minus 0.05, that's going to be 0.02. So let's move these objects 0.01 from the 0 z axis. Now let's duplicate these objects again. This is going to be our glass window. Now let's move these objects first on the side. Now let's create subtraction object. Ctrl C, Ctrl V. Now let's duplicate these onto the rest of the windows. Let's first edit the height, 0.1, because these is going to be our subtraction objects, and then let's move it 0, and then let's move it to 0 z axis. Now let's duplicate these onto the rest of the windows. Now let's select all these subtraction objects and select the other objects. Now let's select the objects to be subtracted. No, let's combine these objects first. Now let's select the objects to be subtracted. Let's probably just select all and then click Ctrl to deselect the other objects. Now let's combine these objects, and now let's do the subtraction. Let's select the subtraction objects and then the object to be subtracted. Now let's check on the elevation view, or the perspective view. Now let's edit the height of the glass window. Let's edit the height, 0.0, or the thickness, 0.003, and then let's combine. Now let's move it onto the exact location. Now let's move it onto the center of the window. And just do the same method onto the rest of the front doors and windows. Let's fill in those gaps. Edit height 0.04, and then let's move it 0.001. Let's check on the perspective view. Now let's trace the vertical moldings. Let's just use rectangular object. Edit the height 0.05. Duplicate for the mid part. Edit the height. It's going to be taller than 0.05. Let's probably use 0.06. Let's check on the perspective. Okay, let's duplicate this again. Edit the height, taller than 0.06. Probably let's use 0.07. Now let's combine these objects. Now let's duplicate this onto the other moldings. Now let's recreate the upper molding of these windows and doors. Let's just use a subtraction object. A rectangular object. Let's just assume it first, and probably let's adjust it on the plan view. Let's edit the height. 0.05, no, 0.1. Duplicate. Let's edit the height. 0.08, probably. Duplicate. At the moment, we're just doing some assumption because we don't have much details on to this part. Now let's check on the perspective view. Now let's group these objects, and then let's rotate it vertically. Go to the section view, rotate, and then let's move it on to the floor level. Now let's snap it on to the exact location in the floor plan. Okay, now for the moldings, let's actually move it aligned with the exterior wall. Now let's move the upper molding. Now let's move these objects. Now let's recreate the steps. Now let's check the height of the steps. It's 0.15. Duplicate for the second step. Edit the height, 0.3. Duplicate this again. For the third step, now let's actually move the floor plan. Okay, let's trace again the step. Edit the height, 0.45. Duplicate for the last step. It's going to be 0.6. Let's check on the elevation view. The perspective view. Now we're done with this part. Let's recreate the roof, the architrave, and the columns. Now let's go back to the plan view and let's start recreating the upper moldings and the roof. Now let's check the height, or the length of the roof. That's 13.088. Edit the height, 13.088. Now let's do some subtraction. Now let's scale. Let's probably first align the subtraction object. Now let's check the length to be subtracted. It's 12.507, and then let's move it 0.1 meters from the 0-Z axis. Let's check on the perspective view. Now let's do the subtraction. Okay, now let's do the moldings. Let's first create a hole onto the front part so that we could insert moldings onto this. This is going to be, let's move it 12.717 from the 0-Z axis. 12.717. Let's double check. .717. Let's do the subtraction. Okay, now let's recreate the moldings. Let's trace the first layer. Now let's edit the height, and this should be shorter. Let's move it 12.717 from the 0-Z axis. Right click, scale, 0.3721. Let's edit the height, 0.38, 0.36. Okay, now let's duplicate these. Right click, At the moment, we're just doing some assumptions. We don't have much detail on this. Now let's edit the height, and it should be shorter, probably 0.34. Duplicate this again, right click, edit basic polygon, edit the height, probably 0.3. Now let's edit this, 0.35, and then this one will be 0.31. Then duplicate this again, edit the height, let's use 0.3, duplicate, edit, and then let's edit the height, probably 0.28. Let's check on the perspective. Okay, now we're good with this. Now let's duplicate this again, right click, edit the height, probably 0.27, and then duplicate, right click, edit the height. Let's go to the perspective view. Let's change the height, probably 0.24 or 0.23. Duplicate. Edit the height, 0.22, duplicate, right click, edit the height, probably 0.18, duplicate, edit the height, 0.16. Let's try. Yeah, that's good. Edit the height, 0.15, duplicate, Let's probably edit the height. 0.13. Okay, I think that's fine. Now let's recreate the architrave. Now what we're going to do here is that we are going to create a rectangular object, or we are going to trace first a rectangular object as per the length of this molding. Let's check the height. It's the same as the upper part moldings. That should be 13.088. And then we are going to trace this negative side of the moldings, and then we're going to subtract it onto that rectangular object. Click on draw extrusion body. Now start tracing from this part. Right click, close, and let's try to re-edit and align it. Now let's edit this rectangular object. Scale. Let's edit the height. Probably 15, and then let's move it on to the 0z axis. Let's probably move this a little bit downward because this is going to be the subtraction object. Now let's duplicate this and then rotate it 180 degrees on the y-axis. Now let's move it on to the other side. Let's edit the rectangular object. Now let's duplicate this, and then we are going to tilt this horizontally. So we're going to tilt this 90 degrees on the y-axis, and then move it. Edit the size, right click, scale. Now let's check on the section view. Now let's move it on top of the architrave. No, not on top, but rather aligned with the architrave. Now let's select. Okay, onto the other part. Let's adjust the location. Okay, now let's select all the subtraction object, and then select the rectangular object. Click Control. Okay, now let's do the subtraction. Let's see. Okay, now let's probably try to resize the subtraction objects on the side. Click Ctrl Z to undo, and then let's probably adjust this. Oh no, let's rescale the rectangular object. Let's check on the other side. Try to rescale a bit shorter. That's fine. Let's check. Okay, now let's try it again. Let's see. We still have a problem on this side. Same with the other side. What's happening? Oh, because the rectangular object is bigger than the subtraction objects. Let's probably just move it a bit. Okay. Let's see. Okay, now we are done with the upper part. Let's trace this part of the architrave. Rectangular object. Edit the height or the length. It's going to be 12.717. Duplicate, scale, check the length. $12,765. Let's probably put dimension to so that's going to be 0.01 difference. Now let's edit the height of this. 12. Oh no, sorry, this one should be on the 0 and then 12.717 and then 0 and then the height 12.77. Let's duplicate this. Scale, height 12 point 77, and the upper part is 12.78. Sorry. I'll duplicate this. Now let's edit scale. The height should be 12.76. Let's check on the perspective view. Okay, now we are good with the architrave and the roof part. Later on, we will just gonna put a roof on the upper part of the building. Now let's recreate the columns. But the thing is, we are not going to recreate this in Dialux Evo, same as the balusters, because this is gonna be hard to recreate in Dialux Evo, or there's no way that we could recreate this in Dialux Evo. But we could recreate this using a third-party software, which is CAD or SketchUp, then export it to SAT files or 3ds file. So I still have the 3ds file of these, or the object file of the columns and the balusters. So I'll probably just gonna share this with you. Now let's go back to the plan, and then let's import the columns. Now let's position it onto the exact location, and let's rescale this as per the exact size. Now let's check the front elevation. Let's check the height. It's 4314. Now let's check the height of the column. Let's edit it to 4.314. Now let's check if it's on top of the floor. Okay, let's double check the height again. Yeah, 4314. Now let's duplicate this. Now as for the balusters, we will just gonna import this later on. Now let's rotate this horizontally, and then we will snap it on to the exact location on the plan. Let's probably move the site development plan onto our main area. Okay, now let's rotate. Now let's move this. Now let's move it right on top of the column. Let's check on the perspective view. Okay, now we are good with this. We are going to insert roof, and also let's re-edit this part because this is going to be a tapered ceiling. Now let's go back to the original CAD file, and then let's copy this part of the section and then paste it onto our Dialux drawing. Okay, that's fine. Now let's resave these. Now let's go back to our Dialux file. Now go to the Plan tab and right click onto that drawing file and then select Refresh. Now let's import that file again. click open. Okay, now let's trace this part of the lobby. Let's go to the furniture tab. Okay, now let's trace this upper part. Let's trace it. And let's create a subtraction object for the tapered part. Let's just edit the height once we snap this onto the exact location. Let's rotate this horizontally. Now let's check the distance from the floor or from the grid line, which is our floor level. .802. Let's create a guide. Create a rectangular object. And then edit the height 4.802. Move it on the 0z axis. Scale. This is gonna be our height, our guideline. Let's check. Now let's edit the length of this object. Now let's delete this. Let's create a subtraction object first for on the entrance. Let's clean this up. Just draw a rectangular object. Now let's move this exactly on this part. And then let's do the subtraction first. Let's check. Okay, now let's move on to the interior. Let's combine these objects. And then let's subtract this tapered subtraction object. Let's see. Yeah, okay, now let's combine, let's subtract. Okay, click undo. Let's combine the other molding. Now let's do the subtraction again. Select the tapered object and then let's do the subtraction. Let's check. Okay, that's it. I don't think we need this object. We could probably just delete this because it's just going to overlap the other object. Now let's edit these two interior boxes, adjust it, but before that let's move first the floor plan onto our main area. Now let's edit these two boxes because these walls are going to be high walls. So let's edit this. Then let's duplicate this. Scale. Edit height. Let's go to the elevation view. Let's just edit this manually or scale up manually. Let's check. Okay, now let's duplicate this object and move it onto the other side. Now let's create a ceiling on the hallway on both sides of the building. Let's edit the ceiling height. Let's check the ceiling height. That's going to be 3.303 from the zero grade line, and then the height, it's gonna be 997. 3.303 height 0.997, or let's just probably scale this up aligned with the interior wall. Let's see. Yeah, that's good. Now let's duplicate this onto the other part. Let's re-edit. Okay, duplicate. Check on the interior. Let's duplicate this and then move it on top, and then let's scale it and edit the width aligned with this high wall, duplicate, and let's move it on the other side just to cover up the gap. Let's move. Let's check. Okay, now we're good with this. Now let's insert a roof. Now let's move this roof plan again. Now let's insert the roofs. Now let's go to the furniture tab, and then let's go to the catalogs and then click on the object catalog. Now let's go to the outdoor planning. And then let's use this hip roof 7x5 and also hip roof 9x5. Now let's start with this roof. Now let's rescale this. And then let's move it on top of the interior walls. And then let's check the height. That's going to be 1.35. And then let's duplicate this onto the other part. Rotate. Let's check. Now let's put a roof on the center part. Move. Rotate 90 degrees on the z-axis. Scale. No, I think we've got the wrong roof. Let's double check. No, not this one. Yeah, this one, the ridge roof. Okay, this one. Let's rotate it. Let's delete this. Let's move it. Scale. Now let's move it on the elevation view. Edit the height. Let's check. .969. edit the height 0.969. Okay, that's it. You don't need to be perfect on the roof because the roof will not be seen from this view. It's just that I want to put a roof on this building. So yep, now we are done recreating the whole building. Now let's add textures onto these. I'm just gonna use the same beige paint that we use on the windows and columns. Let's edit this first. Let's subtract the mid part. Okay, that's already cleaned up. Now let's continue applying textures. Let's combine these objects. Let's add texture. Let's combine these objects. I forgot to combine these. Just click Control when you want to deselect other objects. Now let's combine. Also, let's edit the upper molding of this part. Let's combine. Let's move it. Scale. Let's probably just edit the length up to this part of the ornament. Okay, now let's check. Now let's continue applying textures. Let's use the same paint texture on the interior. Let's check. As for the roof, let's just leave it as it is. And then for the floor texture, I'm going to use a beige marble. Now let's go to the create texture material and let's import that beige marble. Now let's edit the size, probably 3 by 3. Let's add some reflective coating. Let's use 10%. Now let's apply that texture onto the floor. Same as the interior. Now let's check. Okay, now we are done applying textures. Let's import the balusters. Let's go to the elevation drawing. Let's rotate this 90 degrees. Now let's just duplicate these. Before we continue duplicating the balusters, let's apply texture. Now let's duplicate these again. Let's combine. No, we cannot combine 3ds file. Let's group these objects. Now let's duplicate these onto the other balusters. Now let's group these balusters. And then let's rotate this again. Ungroup, deselect this object. Let's group it again. Now let's rotate. Now let's snap it on to the exact location. Let's check on the perspective view. Okay, now we are done recreating the facade of this building, and to make this simulation more appealing, you can actually trace the site development plan. I'm not going to teach you on how to do this because it's just an easy trace subtract method, and then you can add planters, bushes, and palm trees later on. Now, moving forward with the lighting design concept that I made for this project, that was already 5 years ago. And I'm not going to teach you on how to import luminaires because I'm assuming that you guys already know how to do this. I'm just gonna discuss the concept and the lights that I used for this project. To accentuate the columns, I used super narrow beam, which is actually 5-degree beam adjustable in-ground uplight from Vega. I used the 16.5 watt version because I want the columns to be brighter than the rest of the facade, and it's going to be tilted towards the mid part of the columns. Now for the windows, I used in-ground uplight wall washer from Vega to highlight the window, and not just to highlight the window, but rather to give emphasis on the depth between the exterior wall and the columns and the windows to create that 3D effect on the front facade of the building. Now, moving forward with the main entry, I used the same in-ground uplight on the columns. And then for the upper part of the main entry, I just used 5 watt per meter LED strips with aluminum profile, the same fixtures for the uppermost part to highlight and also to give emphasis on the monumental effect on the main entry. Now, for the rest of the areas, this is actually for the landscaping. I used medium beam spike lights for the palm trees or medium height trees, and then I've added bollards on the planters and bushes. Now for the main entry gate, I used this 3.5 meter high light building element from Vega. So that's it, guys. That ends our tutorial for this on how to recreate realistic looking facade in Dialux Evo. I'll see you on to the next episode of our Dialux Masterclass, on which I'm going to start series of tutorials on how to recreate complex objects or complex design elements or furniture using mainly the default objects of Dialux Evo. I'll see you.